Hey, everybody. Thanks for being with us as we close out the week and as we close out the first chapter of the book of Ruth. We are in the 19th verse of chapter 1, and at this point, Ruth has stated very beautifully her commitment to Naomi and her desire to stay with, not more than her desire, her intention to stay with Naomi. And so this is just the rest of the story through chapter 1. So jump in here at verse 19, and we'll come back and discuss it. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Call me no longer Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned together with Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, who came back with her from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Maybe a tough place to leave over for the weekend, but now we find Naomi and Ruth returning to Naomi's homeland, and I'm trying, Michael, to do a little math. We've been here several years in Moab when they had lived there about 10 years. So we're somewhere about a decade removed, maybe a little over, from when Naomi left, and she is still recognized. People know her when she returns, and yet she is not the person that left. And she literally spells that out in this idea that they should call her a different name. But the idea is that the young woman who was married with sons went away 10 years ago, and that's not the woman who comes back. The woman who comes back is a widow who has lost deeply and has experienced bitterness and struggle. And she communicates that with this idea, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. And Mara is that's the Hebrew word for bitter. And we can get into her explanation of that, but I think it's kind of a poignant moment, Michael. It's a heavy moment, but she comes back still fully encased in her grief. And I wonder if you're a person who has been through difficulty, the idea of going back to a place, there's something, if you think about home and what a treat it is to return to your home at times and how good that feels, when that's fraught with pain, the exact opposite experience is true, and that seems to be the case here for Naomi.
Yeah, no doubt. In fact, Clint, I think that we as modern readers may struggle a little bit to locate ourselves within the culture of this text. And one of the key things that happens actually throughout the Old Testament is the importance of the name. Naming a person is not just about what that person's called by their family. It also has something to teach us about their character and who they are. Names have a real significance. So in this particular story, when Naomi goes, the name Naomi, like you said, has in its meaning sweetness. But Mara has in its name the meaning bitterness. So the one who leaves sweet comes back bitter. The one who left with a kind of vivacious life comes back deeply grieving and in pain. And that is not just a characterization of Naomi. It's not just something to teach us about her experience. It's to give us some context ourselves to understand this is the state of Naomi's soul. This has been her experience of the world. The Bible does not often give you a character's internal thought. It's not that kind of book. It's not a story told with our modern conventions where you hear in someone's thoughts and then you hear what other people say about that person, and that gives you an opportunity to empathize. The Bible has its own way of doing that. And here, this shift in name is here to help us understand the person returning to the house of bread is a person who's coming back with nothing. She's coming back again in search of food. She left looking for food. Now she comes back without her family in grief, looking for food. And in this case, all that she has that she returns with is bitterness. And importantly, her daughter-in-law, Ruth. This is an unbelievably powerful connection that you go with your sons and husband and you come back with this woman from, and we see this explicitly named here, a woman from Moab, Ruth the Moabite, as if the author wants us to know, hey, remember where Ruth is coming from. She's not returning as an Israelite. She's returning to Israel with her mother-in-law. And I think, Clint, that is a really important way that this author helps us understand not just what's happening, but what's happening inside these characters.
Yeah, I agree, Michael. The Bible doesn't really do what we would call psychology in a modern sense, but we are left here to try and resonate with some of Naomi's pain, some of her struggle, and uncomfortably she attributes that to God. And I suppose on one hand we could say that is a measure of faith. She lives in a culture that takes it as fact that God does good things and bad things, and that everything that happens is directly from God's hands. And she seems to believe that. And she says, the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, which is not true in terms of food, because we know the story. They moved because of famine. But it was true of her family, even more important than food. But the Lord brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me? The Almighty has brought calamity upon me. And again, we can quibble about these verses from a theological perspective. We could have very in-depth conversations about the whole of the Bible and whether it teaches that God does or doesn't bear responsibility for the difficulties and struggles and pain in our lives. But if you've been through difficult waters, if you have been through painful moments, you know what this feels like. You know that it feels like abandonment. You know that it feels like forsakenness. You know that these words from Naomi are not based in some theological textbook of what is accurate in the big picture of Scripture. This is through the lens of her experience, and it feels to her like God has brought this calamity, brought this struggle to her. And, again, we could quibble with the content, but I'm not sure this is here as a teaching tool. I think it's here as a window into Naomi's moment, into Naomi's soul. And I think, we have to be a little careful making it something else. But certainly when we read, these are hard words. This is a woman who has been deeply wounded and is struggling at every level with family, with loss, with faith. She doesn't even think of herself as the person she used to be because of what she's been through.
I think that there's an aspect of that worth lingering on a little bit, Clint. Don't you think the times when people come to a text like this, verse 21 maybe especially, the end of 20 as well, the Almighty's dealt bitterly with me, Lord brought me back empty, the Lord has dealt harshly, Almighty has brought calamity. The moments when we're tempted to hone in on words like that and then to begin to try to create this big theological structure of making sense of, well, what's God's relationship to calamity and where is God actually? We try to get very specific about what's God and what's human and what's free will and what we get all wrapped up into that. The problem when we do that, Clint, is that we completely blow past the intention of the text, which is to make it clear to us Naomi is suffering. And there are people in our lives who are experiencing suffering, if not you today, that real pain, real struggle. And when you're in that moment, the human reality is these become our words. They're not forced upon us. They just naturally arise out of people of faith, because in the midst of that suffering, there is great struggle.
Well, and I want to, again, I hope we don't overdo this, but having gone through Jonah recently, I want to paint the contrast, because in that book, it was clear that God did things. The scripture was very clear to say this was because of God's action. And there are other parts of the Old Testament where there are parts of the New Testament where something happens to a person and the text makes it abundantly, explicitly clear that that was done by the hand of God intentionally. But if you remember the beginning of this book, there's nothing that has confirmed that. Naomi's words are her words. These are her interpretations. The broader story has not laid responsibility for this at God's feet. And I think that's significant, because I think that helps us with the intention not to understand the why in the big picture, but to understand the what Naomi is feeling and struggling with. And so she returns to her former home, but she returns broken, she returns vulnerable, she returns with an uncertain future. And you said this, Michael, but I want to repeat it. Notice how often the text reminds us of Ruth's foreignness. She's not just Ruth in this chapter, she's Ruth the Moabite. And that matters. The one thing that Naomi brings back with her is a person nobody wants there. That's her one quote-unquote possession, is a thing of no value in her circumstance. And I think, this is a picture of a woman in a very tough spot.
Yeah, there's 4 chapters of Ruth, and I believe the commentator mentions that phrase, the Moabite, is listed 5 times in those 4 chapters. So it's a repeated phrase, as if to let us know, hey,
don't forget.
Yeah, remember, this is a foreigner coming back to the land. I also want to very quickly point out, because we'd be quick to miss it, that when the whole town sees these 2 women arrive in verse 19, notice that while the whole town is stirred, it's the women who say, is this Naomi? And I really don't have much to add to that, other than just notice once again how consistently this author presents the story from the perspective of the women involved. It is very unique in the way that it's telling the story. And I think that, once again, this is one of the reasons why this book is so loved, is you can enter into a text which was written in a very patriarchal society. That's if you look at the way that it's structured and the legal custom and code and all these things, here this story is not interested in that social order. It's interested in telling the story of these 2 women, and it presents. I think all of us can imagine coming home and the women of town seeing these 2 women come in, and it's them who are asking, "Is this Naomi? Is this the woman who we gathered with and we drew water from the well with, and that we celebrated festivals and weddings with? Is this that person?" And when she comes back and says, "No, I'm a shell of a person. I'm a broken person. I'm a bitter person. I have lost all of these things." Yet the thing that the author does not say explicitly, but I think is really important to remember, the one thing she does come back with is the faithfulness of the foreigner. She comes back with the commitment of Ruth. She comes back with a Moabite who has shown already a deep, deep character and a willingness to be a child of Yahweh, a child of the people, the God of the people of Israel. And Clint, I just think these themes are mingling in important and interesting ways. It would be easy and quick in a narrative like this to, I think, just push past some of these details. She's suffering. Yes, it's been hard. Let's get to chapter 2. But if you slow down a little bit, there's a lot of character work here. And I do think there's also some reflecting upon that gap between the human experience and some of those larger theological questions. And when we are in the midst of the suffering, I think that a book like Ruth helps us see what it looks like to be honest about the suffering without having to need to jump to making theology of how it all fits together.
Yeah, I think there's a lot here. There's a lot of depth. The good news is the story is it has a very rough beginning. This first chapter is full of hard stuff. But it is going to get better. Ultimately, we want to make sure that we hear the difficulty in it so that we can also celebrate the movement in it. But thanks for being with us today as we look at it. Hope you have a great weekend. Hope you'll be able and be interested to come back and continue the story with us.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend.